probably fasted in those 2 years somewhere between 5 and 10,000 people. What was going to be the bliss point for these foods? And if we could find that bliss point and add those things in enough, we'll have people buying those products till the end of time. Who are the people behind that, and what is their agenda? Is this information diverting you away from the natural things that we know are beneficial?
All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Fit Vegan Podcast. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Fran Sabatino. He is a chiropractic physician who also has a PhD in cell biology and, wait for it, neuroendocrinology. I said that properly. From the Emory University School of Medicine. The book of his original research on the effects of brain peptides on the regulation of reproductive hormones was published in 1988. While an assistant professor at the Health Science Center of the University of Texas School of Medicine, he did an extensive landmark research on calorie restriction, stress, aging, and has published a number of major scientific papers in some of the most well-respected peer-reviewed journals in the field of cell biology, endocrinology, and neuroscience. He's also written numerous articles for lay magazine and journals in the area of clinical nutrition, healthy weight loss, women's hormones, stress management, addiction, and healthy aging. He's also the author of Weightless, Compassionate Weight Loss for Life, which just came out in this June of 2024. Dr. Frank and I had the opportunity to talk about fasting, about the SOS movement. We talked about we talked about salt for athletes and non-athletes, whether it would be important or not. We talked about the impact of sugar on the body and on cancer prevention. We talked about the impact of oil. This is an incredible episode. It's probably one of the longest ones I've recorded with a doctor because we went so in-depth in every single topic. You're definitely going to enjoy this one. So grab your popcorn that is oil-free and enjoy this upcoming show. All right. Welcome to the Fit Vegan Podcast. I'm your show host, Maxime Sigouin, and I'm the founder and CEO of Fit Vegan Coaching, a company that is on a mission to help 10,000 people get lean, thrive, and reduce their risk of chronic illnesses by 2033 and 1 million by 2050. I believe that having a fit, healthy body and mind is the foundation to living an incredible life, and this is what the show will give you if you choose to listen and implement. Enjoy the episode and have a great day. All right, Frank, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm excited for us to record an episode for my show. I know we got to connect at NHA maybe a month ago in Cleveland and got to see a different side of your personality when we met.
Well, you got to see me being on because, I'm the director of health education for that organization. So I kind of, schmooze it a little bit more with people and just, I've been part of them, going back into the 1970s, believe it or not. It's been a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's just when I met you originally, we did our recording for NHA. You're like very professional setting. And then I see you in a t-shirt and I think it said Plant Daddy with an eggplant on your shirt. And it just made me laugh. It said everything about your personality at that point.
It was Vegan Daddy. And that was a gift by my partner. So that's kind of an in-joke between us. So it's kind of funny. She did the logo too. She made the logo too.
Oh, that's a homemade shirt.
Yeah, it's a homemade shirt.
Hey, you can sell a lot of those. That was a great shirt.
Look, I raised 5 kids this way, so I am Vegan Daddy. There's no question about it. So
awesome. Well, yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show today. When I told my clients that I was recording with you, they were very excited. They had a lot of questions that I wanted to ask you. So I have a little segment that we'll be covering. But main question when I interview people that do that deep of a work and they're that passionate about what they do, I always like to ask them, like, what drives you to do what you do? Because you do a lot.
What drives me really is to, frankly, to get this message out about a vegan, compassionate lifestyle. When I look out, at the world and a lot of the inequities and the injustice that goes on, I've been vegan since the early 1970s. If you think about that, that's a long time ago. So, the drive for me has been issues of personal health because I am a doctor and I take care of people. So, knowing that there's information that we have in this field that can actually help people reverse serious health issues is one of the things that drives me because that information has been kept from us. We've been distracted away from that and we need to come back to that. So that is a very big issue for me as a physician. but I also am very into the idea of connecting with everything in the natural world. So the idea of animal rights and animal lives and the protection of the environment are all very important to me. And there's nothing that does it like this lifestyle. So that's kind of what gets me motivated to teach and to turn people on and to keep doing this work.
Yeah. So in the early 70s, what was the point that made you want to kind of transition to this way of living? Was it, you're a physician, was it from seeing your patients being sick, or did you have your own personal experiences that led you to this path?
No, I really didn't become a physician until 1977. So
Okay.
what had happened was in my later teenage years, I was in a pre-med program in the City University of New York. And the father of a friend of mine, one of my student friends, was this guy. And I grew up in the Bronx in New York City. So this guy had like an insurance practice out of his home. But what was unique about him was that he had collected an anti-medical library for about 20 years of his life. And he had all of these health pioneers, all these books by people that had been doing this kind of work. And I came through a time in my early life where I had a lot of bowel issues, colitis, a lot of irritable bowel stuff. And I was eating in a very conventional Italian household. So it was a lot of meat and dairy and all of those kinds of foods. And no one ever thought to put together that this would have some impact on how my body was functioning and my bowel was functioning. So it wasn't through all of those years of my childhood into teenage years, it wasn't until I met Louis and I started reading my way through his library that I started seeing this idea of eating more whole plant foods, getting away from animal products, the idea of fasting and things of that nature. And so then I started to put that into my life. And it was very intriguing that in a very short time, it cleared up a lot of those issues. So it kind of got me fired up. It turned me on to realize that. And I said to myself, after all those years of mismanagement by the best specialists in New York City, it took this insurance salesman from the Bronx to fix my colitis. And that's what happened. So then I started doing short periods of fasting. I was eating this way, and it got me fired up to go into that direction. And so that became part of my life even before I went to chiropractic college. But in the early 70s, I was still doing a little dairy and all of that. I had stopped eating all flesh food, but I still was doing some eggs and some dairy. So it took another part of that, the 70s, to get me toward the middle to the end of the 70s, where I made the full commitment to being completely vegan.
And so besides having access to that library of knowledge, what were other resources that you had access to back in the day? Because, people are, I've been vegan for a decade. There wasn't a lot a decade ago, but I'm curious as to like what you had access to learn how to eat properly.
Well, frankly, it was basically the books in his library, but then they were part of the early part of the association you mentioned earlier, that National Health Association, except back then they were called the American Natural Hygiene Society. So it was a
Yeah.
society created by the founders of this way of living called natural hygiene. And natural hygiene was just a way to incorporate, the basic biological requirements and psychological requirements necessary for health. So they talked about healthy plant food, they talked about physical exercise, they talked about psychological poise, they talked about sleep, fresh air, sunshine. So it was a very simple system that was trying to address those biological factors that support life and health. So I had that organization kind of as a resource. I kind of joined up
Yeah.
with that. I started looking at their literature, but frankly, most of it was just reading through the books that Louis had in his library to begin with. And then,
Yeah.
of course, trying it out on, everything is experiential. So trying it out on my own body and then experiencing, an improvement of energy, the resolution of this disease and pathology in my body. So all of that really became, my motivator.
How do you feel about the rise in popularity that this movement has had over the past 5 to 6 years? Because theoretically you've been at it for almost like 50 years of kind of preaching this message, and
Yeah.
I've been at it for maybe like 5 years online, and I'm just repeating myself over and over again. You
Well,
get so I feel like you have a history of that too.
Well, I goof around Dr. Michael Clapper is a good friend. So I laugh with Michael. I say, we were doing this like the country song when it wasn't cool.
Yeah,
Now it's cool. But the truth is, I've been involved with a unique situation because I've been involved in like patient and guest care in major facilities that were residential over many, many years. So,
Yeah.
you know, I was involved in lecturing and teaching and caring for people in a plant exclusive way. So I'm just happy that a lot of the science and a lot of the fields of things like lifestyle medicine have finally caught up with what we know and what we've been teaching for the past 50 years. The nice thing about more modern times is that now we've built an evidence base. You know, we built a little
Yeah.
bit of the science to really highlight the power of what we're teaching. Back then, it was we knew that there were benefits and we knew that there were some studies, but a lot of it was anecdotal, meaning people got well, we saw how powerful it was, and we kept teaching it. But you know, now the evidence base has kind of caught up with it a bit, and then you
Yeah.
see it more in mainstream places. So even in the newsletters of places like Harvard and Stanford and other places, there's so much of this lifestyle component of eating more plant-based and, you know, more natural approaches with lifestyle medicine, so to speak.
Yeah, because there definitely wasn't even a decade ago. There wasn't as many studies as there are today, and it was like, yeah, I heard people felt good. I heard people, got better with cancer or the people that were dealing with, chronic illnesses. But now it's nice to have some hard facts to back it up.
You know what's interesting about that, Maxine, is that there actually was a lot of data. Somehow it didn't make its way into the public. So, for example, the Framingham study has been going on since 1948,
Oh,
looking at population studies based on eating healthier, eating more plant food. The Epic Oxford study, which is the European perspective on cancer, is going on since the early 1990s. And so, you know, we have really hundreds of thousands of people that have actually been studied over the past 75 years. But it's only very recently that we've kind of put a magnifying glass on those studies to see it a little bit better. But frankly, a lot of that data was being gathered over the past 30, 40, 50 years quite extensively.
yeah. It makes me think that social media kind of had its role in helping to spread that message because we didn't have for example, like this podcast, thousands and thousands of people will hear this message. I don't think we had these tools back then. It was only for mainstream media that you could record such a show and that more people would have access to it. So do you feel that kind of helped to play a role in spreading the message?
Yeah, it did. And that to me is the very positive side of the media availability because, you know, there's a negative side where there's so much negative stuff. And then also people who really do not have any background portray themselves as experts and they're
Yeah.
sharing information that could actually be harmful too. But the truth is, your point is well made. By having more access for many millions of more people, you can get a very healthy, positive message out in a way that you never could before. And to me, that's remarkable. Even in science, and I look back when I did my PhD research at Emory Med School back in the 1980s, we didn't have the internet yet. So we had computers, but the bottom line is we were going in the library and you had to carry the books in stacks and you had to go to the copy machine. And so, you know, and I did my whole dissertation that way. Now I
Yeah.
can do that same search in a half hour on my phone. I mean, when you think about that, it's mind boggling.
Yeah.
So I think there's some really major benefits, but we always have to be careful because there's always that other side, the yin and the yang of all of this, where there could be a negative use of media. Same thing when we see the flourishing of AI now. You know, there can be some very positive things that come out of that, but who's programming that? And, you
Yeah.
know, who are the people behind that and what is their agenda? And, you know, what is the greed and the avarice and the agendas of the people behind all of it? And so that gets tricky. But as far as the technology, it's a remarkable technology that allowed more information to spread in ways that it never could before.
How would one go about deciphering between, a good source of information online versus a bad source? Because as you shared that, it made me think of you've heard of Paul Saladino online before.
Yes, I
The
have.
Yeah, so he just posted a video about like an animal base meal and it was spaghetti squash and like Simon Hill and those guys made fun of him. It was like it's only not plant based when he's saying it basically, but it was spaghetti squash and he was saying it was animal based. Yeah, so like how can people decipher?
You know, it's very difficult because, you know, anyone can put themselves out as an expert, and there are a lot of lies out there. But what you can do is many times you need to sometimes go to the source of a study and look at it a little more carefully, and then go behind the source and see who's funding the study and
Yeah.
see what does anybody have anything to gain by this information? Is this information diverting you away from the natural things that we know are beneficial, like sleep and plant food and all of that? So you've got to evaluate the study a little bit better. You got to see who's behind it, what's the agenda, who's financing it, as much as you can do that as a lay person. So to me, when I look at it, when somebody says something, I want to go into the original data points. No, I'm trained to do that. That's harder for the general population, but
Yeah.
many times you'll find that what they're spreading, the message they're spreading, is just really their personal interpretation of data that is not exactly what they're presenting. And so you do have to be a little bit wary of this. And then there's organizations that you can trust. So, you go to groups like the NHA, or you go to the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, some of these groups that are doing really base level, good quality research, and their only agenda is to get information out there. And so
Yeah.
that's how you can trust that a little bit more. So you got to start looking at, who can you trust, and what are they saying, and who's benefiting, and who's financially benefiting from it.
Yeah. If they're trying to sell you a supplement after, you kind of know that, this study might be
Yeah, the
pseudo.
guy's telling you the benefits of this supplement, and he's making $1 million selling it. I start to wonder, is there really the value that he's saying? So let me look at that a
Yeah.
little bit closer. And it's not that the product may not have value; it may, but the key is you got to kind of filter your way through it just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to go back to your story for a second. So you studied as a chiropractic to be a chiropractic physician. And so how was it for you to kind of intertwine the world of, whole food, plant-based eating, this whole lifestyle aspect into your practice when you first started?
Well, it started for me when I was actually in my training program, because I went to chiropractic because I had already gotten into that world of natural hygiene. And I knew I wanted to be able to teach people about this very natural way of living, grounded in plant food and all of that. And when I looked at what was available to me, I didn't really want to get involved in drugs and surgery. So I knew
Yeah.
that medical training, because I finished a pre med program. I could have gone in that direction, but I decided, that wasn't going to be really my way. And then I found some really passionate, like turned on chiropractors who were very cool, old school. They were coming from the heart. And I started meeting them, and I said, this may be a much better way for me, because I can still be licensed as a doctor, but now this is very much a part of a drugless, natural healthcare profession. So it was really a no brainer to be a chiropractor and be able to counsel people with nutrition, with fitness, exercise programs, all the things that were important to me. So what happened is, when I was in chiropractic college, I actually started an American Natural Hygiene group, and I brought in the doctors that were doing that work, and they would come and lecture to students. And many of them were actually chiropractors, with
Yeah.
very few exceptions. And so I said, wow, this is a cool way for me to go on and do what I want to do. So it was a no brainer. So by the time I got involved in as a chiropractor and I was licensed, I actually went and did an apprenticeship with one of the fasting doctors, because I was part of this association of docs that actually supervised water fasting. And so I went and I spent a little over a year with Dr. David Scott. He ran a fasting institution in one of the suburbs of Cleveland called Strongsville, Ohio. And he had his own blood lab where he was measuring the blood studies on fasting patients. And I ran his laboratory for a year. So I got a chance to really, learn about what's going on in the fasting process. And so it was really a no-brainer. I just kind of evolved with me starting in school and just continuing after school to want to incorporate this way of living and teaching.
What was your first introduction to fasting? Was it through that library of your favorite
Yes, it was
author?
reading Dr. Shelton's book, Fasting Can Save Your Life, which was an old paperback that he wrote many, many moons ago. And then actually trying it in my own life, short periods. Now, understand that, growing up in an Italian household, the idea of voluntarily not eating would put you in the kind of the realm of insanity in an Italian household.
Yeah.
And what happened is, I remember one of the first times I fasted, this is the truth. I said, this is like this big monumental thing. So I'm going to stop eating for this day. I lived near a place in New York City. It was called the Bronx Botanical Garden, which was really a beautiful nature sanctuary. So all of us people in the city, all of us kids, teenagers, we would spend a lot of time in the gardens, in the park, because it was like going to the country, and it was right in
Yeah.
the middle of the city, right? So I went in, I went up on this hill. It was Cherry Blossom Hill, and I was going to fast for this full day. And I remember laying on this hill. I just stopped eating breakfast. So now, lunch is coming. I missed one meal. And I
Yeah.
thought I was like Mahatma Gandhi on this hill. I'm fasting here for the emancipation of humanity. It's very funny. I come to find out later that it takes about 3 days to even get into a fast. But the
Yeah.
bottom line is, I didn't know that then, and it was a big step, and it was a monumental achievement. I remember going full 24 hours, and I thought, wow, what I had accomplished. And people
Yeah.
like Shelton and them back then were running like 40 and 50-day fasts. They were doing these extensive, long fasts back then. We don't
Yeah.
typically do those much like that anymore.
Yeah. Was it more was it more for people that tend to be dealing with sickness? Because uh, I think I've shared this with you, but my late partner had cancer, and that's once she got sick, that was like her in into looking to all of these things. But
Right.
normally, as a healthy person, they don't look for these alternatives to kind of optimize
Yeah,
themselves.
I would say your point is well made. I would say back then, it used to be people trying to deal with some pathological condition that they either found that medicine didn't help or the traditional ways of doing things didn't work as well. So they wanted
Yeah.
to really give fasting a shot. And, my first job after chiropractic college, after I worked with Dr. Scott and did that apprenticeship, I got hired as the health director of a place called the Shangri-La Natural Hygiene Institute. And in the 1970s, it was in Bonita Springs, Florida, on the Gulf Coast, and they had 110 people a week there, and we would
Wow.
have 40 to 50 people fasting a week, and I was the only doc, and it was only like $300 a week, so people could come, and it was really, really raw. It was mostly raw food, all plant based, and people fasting. And I'm telling you that it was trial by fire. I had the most serious cases up and down. And I had a
Yeah.
medical internist, this black guy that was Kofi Cathcart. He was a medical internist. He happened to be a raw food vegan back in the 1970s. He lived about a half hour north of me. He worked out of Fort Myers Hospital, and he would come down once a week and do all the blood draws, because we would do blood tests. We would check everybody very carefully. So he would draw the bloods. He would give a little lecture. He'd do a little consultation with people. So the two of us, he came like once a week, but I was the ongoing, person monitoring those fasts every day, twice a day. So yeah, that was my trial by fire. I was there 2 years, probably fasted in those 2 years somewhere between 5 and 10,000 people in those 2 years.
Wow.
And I'm talking about everything from autoimmune diseases to early forms of cancer to, asthma to high blood pressure, whatever, any number of things. And so it was pretty intense.
Yeah. I want to dive deeper into fasting later on in the
Yeah,
podcast. I want to go back to like food. So, I made some notes that you're obviously you're a big proponent of, eating whole food, plant-based, but
yes,
specifically no added salt, no oil, and no sugar.
right.
Um, so for a lot of our audience listening, they are in the SOS movement and some aren't. So do you mind kind of explaining why the no salt, the no oil, and the no sugar and
Yeah,
the impact that they have?
fundamentally, there's a lot of reasons for that, but fundamentally, the salt, oil, and sugar have been added into food sales and the conglomerates of food production since the 1960s and 70s in an attempt to truly addict people to processed foods that were being sold so they would continue to buy them. Back in the 60s and 70s, there was a scientist, Howard Moskowitz, who worked for companies like Kraft and General Mills, the big food conglomerates that produce a lot of both better food and processed food. And Howard Moskowitz early on was trying to find a way to make the meals that the soldiers in Vietnam were getting more palatable so that they would eat them. So
Yeah.
they started experimenting with adding salt, oil, sugar, all of these things to the food supply, and these companies were hiring him so that he could find what they called back then the bliss point. What was going to be that amount of additive that would give people the greatest amount of pleasure, and that would be the release of dopamine in their brain and transmitters that were tied into the way we experience pleasure and reward. What was going to be the bliss point for these foods? And if we could find that bliss point and add those things in enough, we'll have people buying those products for the till the end of time. And
Yeah.
so he added one more piece to that. He says, we're not going to only add salt, oil, and sugar, we're going to add crunchiness. And when he added crunchiness, that was the beginning of all the chips and crackers and on and on. What they didn't know was that it was going to be the beginning of the pandemic of obesity at the same time. But what it was really doing was to get people to buy these things. As it turns out, the processed food industries today are no different. They're adding those same components so that can addict the population to buying these things, to feeling like they need them to survive. So that's one of the reasons why we want to get people to step back from that addiction and remove that salt, oil, and sugar. Now, we also know that the body needs sugar, but it needs the sugar, the carbohydrates, and plants. Refined sugars have any number of problems from weight gain to diabetes to even cancer production. So
Yeah.
that's a problem. We want to get those foods out. We find that sodium is really needed very little in the body because the body holds on to sodium like a miser. It turns over potassium a lot more. So when you're eating foods like the general public that is so high in sodium, you're putting a lot of undue strain on the body, and sodium will retain so many times its weight in water, which will remarkably raise blood pressure. And higher blood pressure, which is epidemic in the US, is the leading cause of heart disease. So the sodium content needs to be ratcheted down. It's not that we don't want it, we want it in whole foods. It's not
Yeah.
that we don't want sugar, we just want it in whole food. And finally, in oils, there's no animal in nature that isolates the pure fat from their food chain, puts it in big bottles of liquid fat called oils, and then douses it on everything. So we want the fats and oils again in whole foods, whether it's greens, nuts, seeds, avocado. So we need those components. But when we get them in a more natural form, in the way that nature packages them, it builds in a balance. Because otherwise, you're isolating these components to the exclusion of other nutrients. If you look at oil, a food that has fat, let's take an avocado, has so many nutrients. It's got
Yeah.
fiber, it's got so many other nutrients. If I just isolate the oil, I'm eliminating all of that incredible nutrition, including the fiber content, which is so important in a plant exclusive diet. So we're trying to break through the pattern of addiction. We're setting the bar a little bit high. We're reducing what Alan Goldhammer and his team called the pleasure trap, which gives that brain the idea that it needs these foods to survive. And once we improve the taste sensitivity and get rid of those addictions, it's funny how the natural foods start to taste so much better. We tend to gravitate toward them, and we break away from these foods that are locking us in to eating so much ultra processed food.
Yeah. So I'd love to dive into every single one of these components because I have kind of unique questions for each of them.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
so one of them I was going to ask is like, what are your thoughts on fake meat? But obviously it's literally just, high sugar, high oil, and a bunch of processed food. I'm whole food plant based and everything you do is whole food plant based, but some people still have that inclination to want to eat some because it's still vegan.
Right. Well, it's funny. There are some companies that are doing a better job with that. And I don't do commercials, but if you look at companies like Treeline or Kite, they're using like almonds and they're using cashews. The real big problem is a lot of these processed foods are loaded with coconut oil. And
Yeah.
coconut oil has more concentrated saturated fat than animal lard. And so coconut oil was such a big part of vegan diets, and it's such a big part of these processed foods. So yeah, you do have to move away from them, but there are some products that are coming down the pike that don't have the high salt and the high fat and the coconut oil. So if you do need to have that kind of a product in your life, there are ways to go about getting it. But your point is well made. We want that to be a very small part of anything, and we
Yeah.
want that diet to be unprocessed and whole food. The truth is, the more whole food you do, the more fit you are, the less weight you're carrying, the lower is the body fat, the better is your performance. All of those things improve.
Yeah, that's how you become a fit vegan ultimately. I'm just gonna put
There
it
you
out there.
go. You become a fit vegan. That's right. So we all want to be fit vegans. You ain't kidding.
Yeah. So love for the salt, I have a specific question. So
Yeah.
I know that when doctors will kind of give talks or kind of talk on these subjects, they usually have in mind the typical American, right? That is eating processed food, animal products, and kind of all these things. And those advices are great for that population in the world. But I'm curious as to for the people that are eating whole food plant-based, that are physically active, that are fit, that are a healthy body weight, would there be a detriment to having a little bit of salt, a little bit of oil, and kind of treating themselves like, hey, it's my, wedding anniversary. I want to have some vegan chocolate
No,
cake with my husband.
a little bit is not going to be a big problem, but the problem is that, for most people, if you could have controlled it, you would have, and typically they don't. So the key to it is that when you start making the changes we're talking about, see, you're coming from a place, the question comes from a place that I'm eating a certain way, and if I don't have these things, I'm going to feel a little bit deprived by not having them. I want to change that narrative because my mentality is that when you start making these changes, you no longer need them. You're no longer even attracted to them. But let's suppose you wanted a small amount of salt. We need between about 500 to 750 milligrams of sodium a day. The government's telling us we need 1,500 to 2,000. I think that's kind of genuflecting to the industries that are putting so much salt in food. Truth
Yeah,
is, plant foods will provide all of that sodium, especially when you look at things like zucchini and tomato and celery and Swiss chard. These are much higher sodium foods. So, incorporating a lot more herbs and spices, incorporating more sodium rich foods, you find you don't really need to add it. But if you're going to add it, make it a very small amount. And what I tell people is don't cook with it, just get a little pinch and maybe put it on top of your baked potato if you need it. And then
yeah,
you can do it, you'll taste it, and you won't get into like cooking with all of this. But the real solution, and I find a lot of vegan people don't do this, is they're not using enough of the herbs and spices that are available because
yeah,
they provide such a variety of flavor, and the nutrients in these foods are so high that we need to put them in our salads, and we need to put them in our cooked Buddha bowls, and we need to put them in our cooked dinner entrees. And what will happen is your taste will be satisfied and you won't need to be putting a lot of sodium and salt on the system. The other thing we know is that if you look at blood vessels, the inner lining of a blood vessel wall is called the endothelium. The endothelial cells are the part of the cells of a blood vessel that are closest to the space where blood is moving. We find that there's a gel-like covering of that inner lining called the endocalyx. And what we find is that endocalyx plays a role in how the blood vessel wall produces nitric oxide so that it can dilate, allowing blood to flow into all the organs and muscles and tissues of the body. We find that sodium, when it becomes more excessive, damages that endocalyx so that now you get more irritation, more clotting on that lining. You start blocking blood supply and you start creating damage in the heart, the brain, and you can start having little bleeds where these little vessels
mm,
are bleeding in the eye and the kidney. And so, you just got to be sensitive to the fact that the body holds on to sodium like a miser. When you look at the way the body controls blood pressure, there is kind of a conspiracy of organs that include the lungs, the liver, the kidney, and the adrenal glands, where the end result is that the kidney will hold on to sodium and will eliminate potassium. Why does
mm,
it do that? Because sodium will attract its weight in water. So by having sodium being held onto, that water that it attracts keeps blood pressure high enough so that blood could take care of all the organs and cells of the body. That pressure can feed that blood wherever it needs to go. But if you have extra sodium, you're going to find that it retains too much fluid, and now you've got edema and other problems, and the body's turning over potassium. The only time where that changes is if you have some kind of adrenal problem or low adrenal function or adrenal disease, then sometimes you're eliminating sodium. And in that case, those people do need some additional sodium to keep their blood pressure up. But for the most part, the body holds on to sodium so relentlessly that the amount that's in whole food is typically more than enough to satisfy our need. What we need more is potassium because we're getting rid of it. So guess what? If you look at whole foods, whole plant foods, what are they high in? Well, they're low in sodium and very high in potassium. So the
Yeah.
whole plant food diet provides the balance that we're looking to get through the kidney with sodium and potassium.
So interesting. So I have more of a personal question on this one then. So from an athlete perspective,
Right.
when I trained for, I just played basketball for 2 hours, and I trained for Ironman, I'm doing all these long cardiovascular workouts. I have a high, I would say a high sweat rate. I lose a lot of salt where my face is crispy after I'm done a long workout. And so to
Yeah.
me, when I have these long workouts, I literally get dizzy and I get a headache. And so I will literally go and drink water with salt in it because, and then my headache goes away right away. I don't feel dizzy anymore.
Well,
So I'm
in
curious
your
what would be
case,
a replacement.
yeah, that's a pretty extreme situation because most, remember years ago when people just used to do normal workouts, they'd give them salt tablets. Remember back in the day, this
Yeah,
was
yeah,
something. And then they realized that they really didn't need that. What they needed more was fluid replacement, not sodium replacement. But you're working out at such a level that there may be some decline in that. So having a drink that has a little bit other electrolytes in it, whether it's
yeah,
sodium, potassium, a mix of electrolytes, probably would do you well. But you're an extreme case because most people are not working out like that. You
yeah,
can count the number of people that have probably done Ironmans on a few bodies, and that's it.
yeah.
But bottom line is, under those conditions, yeah, there may be the need for some small amount of that, but that is, again, not as much as you actually would think, because the body really holds on to sodium dramatically.
Yeah, just because we have a lot of athletes in our program that are kind of
Yeah,
in that
absolutely.
similar situation. And I do get that question often. I was like, I'm
I
for the
would recommend
movement.
I would recommend that they do things that provide more electrolyte replacement, including potassium. And in that regard, we make drinks with like lemon and lime in it, soaked dates, things of that nature that provide all of these mineral content. And if
Yeah,
you wanted to add a little bit of a sodium content, you could, but you don't need to overdo that. But I
yeah,
appreciate I appreciate your population, the people that are working and working out at the level you described.
yeah. And I'm gonna try to just maybe do like a higher potassium content versus kind of salt to kind of see how I
Well,
feel.
you can mix it up a little bit. But what I would do is you make just soak, squeeze and soak lemons, limes, some dates in some water, and carry that in your water bottle when you're biking, whatever, and you can replace with that. It's almost like a natural Gatorade kind of thing,
Yeah.
but without loading up just sodium content.
Yeah, I used to make those back in the day. You've been vegan for a long time. So you remember Durian Ryder and Frilly the Banana Girl on YouTube?
Yes, 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 yeah,
Yeah, he used to make Daterade. It'd soak
yeah,
dates and then
yeah.
blend it.
And that worked, and it worked. It worked.
Yeah, yeah. That's awesome. I'm happy I asked that question because I had a lot of athletes ask me that specific
Yeah.
question. They're like, the sodium, but like I get dizzy, I have headaches. And so, just in moderation and kind of playing around with maybe higher potassium would be the way to go.
Yeah, a little mix of electrolytes. Just get it mixed up a little bit. More potassium, sodium, bring a little bit of balance into it.
Yeah. And so in terms of oil, not so that I have a question for oil, but usually people's main arguments is not because a lot of our clients are whole food plant based. They're just looking for that crispiness, on the broccoli, on the cauliflower. So kind of what's your piece of advice for people that are looking for that?
Well, because you can still saute and do all of that without oil. We do it all the time. We just use veggie broth. We use veggie broth with certain herbs and spices, and you can saute and make a stir fry crispy any way you want. You don't need oil to do it. The problem is not only the oil, that oil damages the endothelial lining of blood vessels, not only that it's so calorie dense
Yeah.
and accrues weight, because if you look at oil, it's 4,000 calories a pound compared to 100 with fruits and vegetables. I mean, if you think about that, it's amazing. Um, it also raises the AGE content, the glycated end products in the body, which are devastating for premature aging and inflammation. And the fact of the matter is, it creates that density for people's weight issues and all of it. And you don't. And when you cook oil, there are other things that happen to it
Yeah.
because it becomes hydrogenated, it becomes transformed, and it becomes oxidized. And all three of those things remarkably increase what we call chronic inflammation and oxidative or free radical stress. So, oil is one of the big contributors, especially when it's fried and overly cooked and put under high heat and pressure, creates, again, hydrogenation, transformation, and oxidation. And those are those are major processes that feed chronic disease via inflammation and oxidative stress.
And people use way more than they think. Like if people
Oh,
think they use a tablespoon, I've seen people pour into their pan. That's like that's like half a cup.
again, I'll go back to my early years. I grew up in an Italian household.
Oh yeah,
When
it
I
just
came in when I
drizzling
came in the
everything.
house at the end of the day, I was doused in oil.
Yeah.
It was a ritual. No, it's way too much, and it's one of those things that really gets away from you because you're just starting to pour it on everything. And the truth of the matter is, you don't really need it. And when you get away from it, you don't even miss it
Yeah,
because you can
true.
saute and you can do things with, like I said, veggie broth. You put a little balsamic or rice vinegar, you add some herbs and spices, you saute it up. You can still do all of that and get wonderful, incredible taste without oil and salt.
Yeah. And my wife made me buy a massive air fryer. So she just throws everything in there.
She likes it crispy, baby. She likes it crispy.
Yeah, she loves the texture. Okay, let's talk about the sugar. So we already covered as to why sugar is not good, but I want to talk about the relation to cancer specifically, just because I
Yeah, let's
have the
talk about
history
that.
with breast cancer and all that. So do you mind kind of
Yeah.
sharing the connection between the two?
Yeah. Well, what happens is that, and this is important, because glucose and sugar is so important in the human body. There's only one thing on the planet that can take the energy of the sun in the process of photosynthesis and create glucose, and those are plants. So that carbohydrate goes into the energy factories of our cells, the mitochondria, and in the presence of oxygen, that glucose and oxygen are transformed into high energy bonds that provide energy for all that we do. So sugar is critical for energy. And if you think about it, certain cells of the body need it more than others. One of the most glucose dependent cells is the brain. The brain is only 2% of our body weight, but requires 20% of our energy. So think about that dynamic. So we
Yeah.
need that, and red blood cells also incorporate sugar. So because sugar is important, the body is always concerned with making sure that there's an adequate amount being maintained in the body at any one particular time. The problem is sugar is also a double-edged sword. When sugar goes above that normal level, it becomes one of the most dangerous toxic agents in the human body. Think about someone that has long-term type 2 diabetes. What happens to them? They lose their eyes, they lose their hearts, they lose their kidneys, they amputate their limbs. So
Yeah.
sugar will eat its way through the human body. So the body wants to keep sugar really nicely regulated. So it's got a hormone called insulin that when sugar levels go up, insulin is released, and insulin can attach to receptors on the surface of cells, including muscle cells, which kind of work like a savings account. And when insulin attaches to these receptors, it's kind of like a key going into the lock of a door. So when insulin goes into that lock, it opens the door and the membrane of the cell opens up like an opening door, and sugar enters those cells. So the three things have to happen to control blood sugar. One is the release of insulin, the other is the attachment of insulin, and the third is the opening of the door. Here's the problem. When you look at the major storage form of sugar, the savings account, it's in muscle cells. When you're eating high fat and processed foods and all of that, that fat gets into those muscle cells like oil droplets. And when it's in those cells, there's no space now for sugar to enter. So the body sends a signal and drives the process whereby insulin is no longer able to open those doors. Insulin becomes less efficient. It's almost like you're gunking up the lock, so to speak. And so what happens is now you have a process called insulin resistance. And when the body has insulin resistance, insulin's not attaching, so sugar can't enter those cells. Guess what has to happen then? Sugar levels start going up in the blood. Now, because sugar levels go up in the blood, if that goes on long enough, that'll create a diabetic condition. And then, of course, the doctor will say, Mrs. Jones, you got high blood sugar, you've got diabetes. Don't eat any carbohydrates. Well, that's a big mistake because the problem wasn't carbohydrates. The problem was high fat that
Yeah.
blocked insulin from working. So this is a big mistake. So we see a lot of people, for example, that come to retreats like I run, and they've got type 2 diabetes. We put them on nothing but carbs, all plant food. And the bottom line is, well, plant foods have protein and fat too, but they're high carb foods. And we
Yeah.
find that what happens, we see blood sugar levels drop 100 to 200 points in a week by eating mostly carbs. So the idea, this has been one of the biggest con jobs and lies of the whole management of diabetes, because you've got to change the fat content first so insulin can work better. Here's where we go into cancer. When insulin is not working well and sugar levels are going up, the body begins to believe that it's not making enough insulin. So it starts overproducing insulin from the cells in the pancreas. That becomes known in medicine as hyperinsulinemia, excessive insulin in the blood. The problem is cancer cells have a huge number of insulin receptors. So when insulin levels really rise, it attaches to those cells. And now if there's sugar available, it's going to flood those cancer cells and feed it. And so there's a lot of relationship between refined sugar products and especially the increase in breast density, breast cancer, prostate change, all of that. So the bottom line is you've got to lower the fat content with whole foods. You've got to let insulin work better, allow the body naturally to lower sugar, naturally reduce the excessive amount of insulin. And what will happen is you're no longer going to trigger that cancer cell growth that happens in relationship to insulin and sugar.
That was very well explained. I've never had it been explained to me that way. So basically, um, because you're consuming so much processed sugar, then the body is like, I must be not be doing a good job at producing insulin. So it's
It's not
producing.
only what you're consuming, it's that because of the dietary changes, you've got insulin resistance.
Oh, because
See,
of the fat too.
insulin's not working. That's really the fundamental situation. And when insulin doesn't work, the body thinks it's not producing enough. So
Mm,
it starts over. Now, if that goes on long enough where it overproduces that insulin, those cells that produce it are going to burn out, and now you'll have type 2 diabetes. And if it goes on long enough, you'll never be able to make insulin again, and you'll have type 1 type diet, a kind of a type 1 kind of diabetic change. But that
yeah.
hyperinsulin release is what can begin to drive. And if you got hyperinsulin release and excessive refined sugar and all that, you got all the ingredients that can activate cancer cells.
So this is the other question I was going to ask. So, would it be true to say that everyone has cancer cells in the body and that some of them are just have not been activated yet? Because I want from the perspective of a listener, if they're like, I don't have cancer, why would it apply to me? Well, if everyone kind of has those cells that are kind of dormant and that insulin would attach and it would kind of like become like a sponge to the sugar that's being consumed, it would cause that cancer cell to grow. Would that be accurate, or is there like a little bit more nuances to that?
No, the bottom line is the issues with sugar is that you have to understand with cancer, in our genetics, in our gene pool, there are parts of genes in our bodies called oncogenes. We all have them. They trigger the growth of cancer. We have other areas of the gene pool that suppress cancer. So every day of our lives, every second of our lives, there's this dance of
Mm,
going on where cancer being produced, cancer being suppressed, and the immune system plays a very big part in being kind of like the security guard looking at all of that. All right. So when
yeah.
you have cancer that's overgrowing, typically the promotion is outweighing the suppression. And so now you got more promoted. But what's intriguing is that we now know that there is a field called epigenetics. And in
Yeah.
epigenetics, what we've discovered is that positive lifestyle factors, including physical exercise, including stress management, including whole plant nutrition, they literally turn off the parts of the gene pool that actually produce cancer and they activate the part that suppresses cancer. I don't know if people are aware of this study that was done by Dean Ornish. I'll just mention it because I think it's useful. This was a
Mm,
study of men with prostate cancer, and they had not been surgery, they had not been treated with drugs. So they said, good, we're going to take these guys, we're going to take biopsies of their prostate cancers, and we're going to look at the gene pool in those, and we're going to see what genes are involved, because they do have a map now, what genes might be involved in cancer promotion, all of that. But then we're going to put these men on a lifestyle with a control group that is eating nothing but whole food, plant-based, exercise 5 times a week. In this case, it was walking, yoga 3 times a week, and some counseling. So they did a stress management component. And after a period of months, they said, we're going to go back in and we're going to do biopsies of the cancer cells again. What they discovered was that the men that have participated in the lifestyle modification, over 450 genes that were involved in the expression and promotion of cancer had been turned off by that lifestyle approach. Think about that for a second. That's an
Yeah.
unbelievable mind body outcome when you think about it. So I want people to understand that no matter what your genetics are, you don't have to drown in your own gene pool. You have to understand that you have an opportunity with choices that can literally modify your own genetic expression. And in doing that, you can take a big role, even in a genetically dictated kind of a disease. You can modify it. So you don't have to be that person that says, my father had high blood pressure, my grandfather had high blood pressure, I'm going to
Yeah.
have high blood pressure. It's just not true. And not only that, we also see in cultures that are very different when they start adopting lifestyles that promote cancer, even though their genetics are somewhat different, they will promote the same diseases as people far removed thousands of miles away because those conditions are activating cancer growth. So the truth is, we're producing cancer cells all the time. The immune
Yeah.
system is recognizing them, it's activating other parts of the genetics that will suppress it. And it comes to a point where the damage and the expression of cancer can outweigh the body's ability to control it. And under those conditions, cancer will grow and develop.
I had a guest say at one point, disease doesn't run in the family, diet does. And so it's not because your parent has high blood pressure or cancer or heart disease that it's bound to happen to you. Um, I don't want to step away too much from the conversation about sugar because I have one more question. But the
Yeah.
conversation about cancer, you familiar with
Yeah.
sulforaphanes and like broccoli sprouts and kind of all that? Would it activate some of those same kind of genomes to kind of fight the cancer as not
Yeah, what
consuming
we what we
sugar?
find what we find is that there are two ways, and this is going to get very sophisticated, but I'll try to simplify it. There are two ways that the genes become modified to express themselves differently. One is a process called methylation. And methylation just means you take a little methyl group, which is just carbon with four hydrogens around it, and that literally becomes attached to the architecture of your own DNA. And when it does, it can either hide or expose parts of the expression of that DNA. We find that a lot of plant foods increase methylation to block promoter sites, sites that would promote cancer. The other process is something called acetylation. And this is a little acetyl group, another small chemical group that can attach either to the gene pool, or this is interesting, it can attach to the proteins that the genes are wrapping around so that they can be maintained in the cells. And when they do, the protein spool that the DNA is around can either expand or contract. And when it does, certain sites will open and other ones will close. And depending on which ones those are, cancer can either be promoted or suppressed. So those are the two basic ways that lifestyle, including exercise and food, can affect how those genes are expressing methylation and whatever. And it gets even more sophisticated because we now know that the modification of our own microbiome, the bacteria, and some of the chemicals they produce can actually methylate and change our own genetic expression of cancer. So by feeding healthy organisms with high fiber plant foods, we create the best chemistry of the microbiota, the microbiome, those organisms that live in our gut. And we also have another impact now on what cells are promoting cancer and which ones are not. Think about all of that. It's pretty profound. It's wild.
Yeah. What was the other word? It wasn't methylation. It was another one you mentioned.
Acetylation, acetylation.
Would
Acetylation.
would is it called B17? And then people eat apricot seeds because there's a compound in there that kind of helps with that
Yeah, we don't
process.
know. We don't know all of the ways that that works, but we do know that the B vitamins play a
Yeah.
major role in methylation. So they provide methyl groups. So if you want to look at the high quality B vitamins in all the greens and plants and whole grains, and when you really start thinking about it, getting this diversity of plant foods, you're giving the body the chance to do the methylation and acetylation that's profound. And think about it, that Ornish study, over 450 genes were shut down by
Yeah.
that kind of attachment, by that kind of modification with whole plant foods. And
Yeah.
also, they did exercise and stress management, also important.
Yeah, it was interesting for me to notice through this cancer journey that not just nutrition, exercise was a part of the healing process, like the stress management, the dealing with trauma, and kind of all of these other
What we
components.
find with vegans is many times because their diet, and some of them are active, pretty active too, we find the biggest missing link with them is stress.
Mhm.
And the stress changes in the body, especially for women. How old was your partner when she passed away?
39.
So she was young. So she was
Yeah.
still having her normal periods and all of that. So
Yeah.
sometimes the estrogen levels can get a little higher, and under stress, they can trigger breast cancer changes. And that's
Yeah.
more typical. That's more typical in vegan populations because they're not eating, if they're eating whole food plants, they're not eating the processed foods and things that can contribute to that. So the real
Yeah.
key there is understanding that stress is a major, major component. That's why I spent, even in weight loss, I spent an entire chapter in my whole book going over all of the stressful components that are overlooked all the time.
Yeah, because she was a vegetarian when I met her, but she was running a company like living off energy drinks, protein bars, trying to and hustling. And we did the test and it wasn't a genetic cancer, it was fully a lifestyle created cancer. And it was HER2 positive as well. So it was like
Yeah.
estrogen, it was based off the hormones.
Yeah, there's no question. And the things she was doing were driving the hormones up, and that's another issue. And so once you get that combination of higher hormones like estrogen coupled with stress components, it's a tough situation because it starts activating those alpha receptors in the breast, and you just grow those cancers a lot easier.
Yeah. Okay. As we're talking, it's bringing up more questions for me. So before I go back to my
Oh,
last question about sugar, how do you manage? Because I said you've accomplished a lot in your life, you've done a lot of incredible things. How do you manage that balance between being a high achiever and wanting to impact the world while also trying to manage your, because I'm in that boat. Like I want to help people not get cancer, but I also don't want to give myself cancer out of helping people not get cancer. It's like, how do you
Yeah,
balance
that's a
that?
fine line. That's a fine line. Some of the greatest leaders of this whole profession are people that literally ran themselves into the ground. So
Yeah.
it's a question of how do you find that balanced life where you do your work with passion, but you also recognize that you need to take time for you to replenish. That's the work we all have. So when you ask me how I do that, I've been doing this a long time. Look, I raised a family of 5 kids, and I was taking care of 100 people a week when I did that. I was homeschooling 3 of those kids at the same time. I mean, when I look back at some of the things I did, you can't even believe you did it. I mean, I
Mm.
can't.
Yeah.
When I did my PhD, I was going 22 to 23 hours a day for years. When I finished my PhD, it took me 6 months to a year to recover from that because of
Yeah.
the intensity that went with that. So, what I try to tell people is that as much as you can, you've got to take some times for where you step back from the chatter of your own life. I don't care if it's taking 10 minutes of meditation time or going out and taking a 30-minute walk around the block, doing something that allows you to step back from all of the chatter. And then what happens is when you start making these choices routinely, they become a part of you. So that's a good thing. You're not worrying about my food. Food is easy. You're going to put a little salad
Yeah.
together, you make a few rice and beans, and you're good. And then you make sure you're drinking water and you do the best you can. But taking the time to really de stress a little bit and taking the time to get out into the natural world a little bit and taking the time to support your relationships in whatever way you can. These things are trickier, but they've got to be done. So I tell people you got to take an inventory. You got to take a good look at your life, and you've got to look at what is it you're trying to accomplish, and then are the consequences of your choices in your life actually leading you to that? If they're not, you have to reevaluate, and then you
Yeah.
kind of make it work in another direction. But we all have that job of taking a much closer examination of our own life, the consequences of our own actions, and how is it moving us toward a healthier, more balanced place in the world. That becomes important.
Yeah. And it's such a hard balance to find. Like,
It's
um,
hard, but it's funny because I think a lot of times, and I deal with musicians and athletes like you do. A lot of times people feel if they take that time, they won't have enough time to get done what they need to get done. And many
yeah.
times by taking that time, you actually get more efficient, and you
Yeah.
find that you can accomplish more doing less, and it becomes smarter, not harder, in a way. And that's actually a cool step to get to, because then you realize, yeah, I can make some time for me. I can make some time for my relationship and this. And I beat it up early on. I had kids, and sometimes I wasn't there. I got so tied up with this, and it kind of hurt my first, hurt my marriage at the time. The different things that I had to kind of process through. But we all go through it, and we all can do it better, and we can also all do it smarter, not just harder. And I think that's important.
Yeah, that's I think my biggest lesson of this year. That's why I've been taking a week off every 8 weeks, completely disconnecting. Like after I saw you, I went to New York and Hamptons for a week. No
Yeah,
social
you
media,
told me you
no
were going to go to New
phones.
York. Yeah.
Yeah, it was
And also,
awesome.
you have a wife, you have a family. The bottom line is, if you don't put it back, the relationships start to suffer. And
Yeah,
before you know it, you're moving apart from each other. You may really love each other, but you're not finding a way to connect. You got to have that time for connection. You have to have that. And that's
yeah,
one of the things I learned. And so I brought that to the relationship I have now. But it was a hard act, because I had to learn it by going through a marriage, and certain breakups, and certain traumas related to that. And so,
yeah,
but it's a dance we all have to participate in and look at a little closer.
yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that. So let's go back to that sugar question.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
So let's talk from the athlete perspective,
Yes.
because the goo gels, the sugar gels, every 30 minutes to 45 minutes when you're running, you're biking and all that, like it's a pretty high amount of sugar and glucose that people consume on some of those endurance events and for the
Yeah.
training leading up to it. So like how can people balance that?
The bottom line is, again, that's a mindset that we think has to happen that way. When you're carb loading with these kinds of foods, there is an extension that lasts pretty well. And if you're making these like Gatorade drinks and things of that nature, and getting a little bit of that as you're moving, you're still going to perform at a fine level. I think this idea that we got to keep having these gels, and I would rather see people take a little bit of dried fruit, take a little bit of fresh fruit with them, have that with them. And then with the
Yeah,
drinks that we're talking about and some of the natural foods, I was talking to Colin Campbell, and Steve. You remember Steve Smith, right?
I think so.
Great, one of the great vegan triathletes of all time. He was the king of
Yeah.
the Iron. Is it Steve Smith? Yeah. Well, in his 40s, he was still winning the Ironman triathlon to people in their 20s. And
Okay.
when he would get up in the morning, Colin would say he'd go out and do a small workout. He'd go out and run a marathon before breakfast.
Yeah.
That was his small workout before. Never used any of those things. It was more,
Yeah.
making sure he was hydrated, eating, loading carbs, and doing it a certain way without getting into a lot of refined, sugary products that you feel you have to do. Because in the long run, they do burn up, but the bottom line is they do interfere with higher performance in the long run, in my opinion. So I don't
Yeah.
think you need to do that. But of course, as an athlete, and this most of all, athletes are the most superstitious people on planet Earth. So
For
if
sure.
something works, they're going to do that every single time, because they don't want to take a chance that they break their ritual. Because as soon as they break the ritual, they're not going to succeed. So, it's a lot of mindset with athletes, and
And
this because you work with them even more than I do now. But the bottom line is, once you start freeing up your perception and mindset and realize that you're eating foods, and you can load foods that are going to give you a much longer lasting effect in the way you burn energy, you start to free yourself from a lot of that mindset.
it's cultural also. If you're newer to the sport and you're stepping in, and I was like, oh, everyone's taking those goo gels, and I started off with dates and cash and salted cashews inside of them when I first did my first races. I took 2 dates every 30 minutes for a half Ironman. I overdosed on date. I couldn't eat them. I gagged at the end. There's just so many dates I couldn't
Don't
do
want to see
it.
them anymore. But this reminds me very much of how we looked at bodybuilding at the beginning. If you recall, way back
Yeah.
when, it was either super high protein, constantly animal protein around the clock, and then you're shooting steroids, and then of course we come along with the vegan bodybuilding movement, and it shows that you don't need to do any of that.
Yeah.
You create these beautiful bodies and these high performance athletes without doing any of that. So there's always this kind of pervasive mindset where we're doing this strange behavior we think is so necessary to get the results we want. And then we realize that, all of the biggest performing animals in nature are all herbivore, frugivores. They're eating huge amounts of plant foods, and they're performing at a very high level. So that's what you need to do. You got to come back to that.
Yeah. And I think the movement is shifting as well to people kind of eating
I
more
think
real
so. I think
foods
so
and
too.
yeah.
And you
Um,
would know this better than me, but I feel that too, though.
yeah, we're out there educating people, just not just date, but alternate with bananas and other fruits because you're going to
Well, that's
overdose
the
on
thing,
those
but
if not.
that's my point. But they can eat large volumes of those foods, and you've got sustained energy to perform. That's all you
Yeah,
need. That's what you're really looking for. You're looking for that sustained energy for performance, because that's
yeah,
all athletes are concerned about, performance.
yeah,
They don't care necessarily about health. That's always been a problem with even high trained
yeah,
professional athletes. That's why when they're 50 and 60, they look like they're 80 and 90. They're full
yeah,
of arthritis because in the earlier years, all they were pushing was performance, and they did whatever they could to enhance that. And in many ways, they hurt their bodies doing it.
yeah. No, that's absolutely true. Um, so let's talk about regenerating the body. Let's talk about fasting.
Okay.
All right. So for the people that are listening, what is fasting? What does it consist of, and what does it do?
Well, fasting very simply is just the abstinence from all food with the exclusion of water only for some period of time. That's the definition of true fasting. People
Yeah,
use fasting to talk about doing juices, or they talk
yeah,
about intermittent fasting. Those are not really true fasts because you're still eating and you're still taking in nutrient. True fasting relies on the idea that if you think back in history, in our own history, there were periods of time when food was rather scarce. We lived in a tough environment. Sometimes food was available, sometimes it wasn't. So the body had to adapt to scarcity. And it did that by creating physiological responses that allowed it to deal with deprivation. What we've discovered is that by allowing the body to experience that period of scarcity and deprivation, it promotes a unique kind of detoxification and healing by allowing the cells to shift away from a growth mode into a more maintenance and repair mode.
yeah,
And that process is also given the term autophagy, which really is about this idea of house cleaning and self regeneration. It's a process of autophagy. It's a cellular process where the body gets rid of old debris, worn out proteins, broken down pieces of cells, viruses, bacteria. But it does that because when you take away nutrient, the body shifts from using nutrients for growth of cells into using that energy now for all of that house cleaning. Because the house cleaning is going on all the time, but you've got energy being diverted into growth and repair. So now you're moving it much more into repair and regeneration. So there's a tremendous regenerative outcome that can happen with fasting. But we also do it in a complete resting state. And there's a lot of people who do it and recommend it very wrong. There's people online recommending people fast with high intensity exercise. It's
yeah.
a
I've seen
huge
that.
mistake because energy cannot be everywhere at the same time. If I drive it into the muscles for action and activity, I'm taking it away from cellular repair and healing. So by resting, we harbor that energy, we hold on to it, and we make the judgment that the body has a good idea of what it needs to do. I don't need to tell the liver how to heal. The body
Yeah,
has the intelligence to do that. So all I need to do is get the hell out of the way and give it the energy to be able to do that or allow it to have that energy. So fasting is that simple, but because it's so simple, it is so profound by allowing so much cellular change to occur. And what happens is because you have no food coming in, you've only got about 24 to 36 hours of sugar reserve in the liver and muscles in the form of glycogen. So after that first day and a half, you use all that up. And now, if you're not eating anything, now you're stuck with this notion I need energy, but I don't have sugar and glycogen. Where am I going to get it? So the body starts creating energy from two other things, protein and fat, which we have in the body. As it turns out, in the first day or so, it uses a little more protein, but under resting conditions, because it's so energetically beneficial, it shifts into fat metabolism. And of course, we call that state ketosis or ketogenesis, and the body starts burning up your fat reserves for energy. And if you look at someone on a fast, between days 3 and day 10, you see this escalating increase in fat use in the body. And then around day 10, it just levels off at a very high level. So early on, it's still using a small amount of protein, but it's moving more and more into fat. And this has been one of the things that people were very concerned about. I'm going to fast, I'm going to waste away, I'm going to use up all my muscle tissue, it's going to all disappear. We find that in the first few days of fasting, you're using a couple of ounces of protein a day. By the time you get into the third or fourth day, you're using about a half an ounce of protein from muscle mass in the body. That means if you fasted 30 days, you lose a pound of protein. I mean,
Yeah.
think about that. And so that's a very unfounded fear. And the changes are so fat related, and nothing gets rid of belly fat like water fasting, and nothing keeps it off, which is one of the more dangerous levels of fat in the body. And nothing keeps it off like the fasting process. So fasting is really nothing more than a energy harboring process. It's a resting state, but it allows deep physiological repair, cellular regeneration, and change.
And I think you mentioned earlier, like a minimum to kind of get into that state would be 3 days.
About 3 days is about where it's at. Now, some people, if they are more metabolically efficient, may get there a little sooner, but there's still about 24 to 36 hours that have to pass before you're into a true fast.
And so I know obviously there's the center and you're a part of it with True North. You're involved with
No,
them.
I'm not a part of their center. I just
Okay.
counsel on their consultation service.
Okay, that's what I
I
saw.
live in I live in Florida, but I do monthly retreats in Florida where it's a week a month. And in that
Okay.
week, you can either eat SOS free food, you can do green juice, or you can do about a 5 day water fast under my supervision. And that's called balanceforlifeflorida.com. That's the website for that. We do it monthly. True North
Okay.
is really perfect for doing longer fasts. I don't have a residential center like I used to have. So we have
Okay.
this beautiful hotel, the Wyndham Hotel, right on the ocean in South Florida. So we do week-long retreats once a month.
Okay. I'll put the link down below also for the people
Yeah,
listening
that's
if they
fine.
want to
Yeah,
check that
and
out.
people can go and check it out online, and you can see it. We have another one coming up August 11th for a week. So every month
Okay.
we have them, and we keep it only to 10 people at the most, so I can work with everybody one on one and personally. And I lecture every day, and we have yoga every day. We have fitness classes every day. The hotel has a gym if people want to do resistance training. There's a lot of different things. The hotel is fabulous for that, and we train their kitchen staff to prepare the food that we want. So they do
Yeah.
exactly what we want with food.
What are some of the so you mentioned like kind of like that's 3 to maybe like 7 day range in terms of water fasting. What are some changes that people typically see within that range?
Well, you're going to see initial fat loss, which is a big issue because we want to get body fat down. But about the fourth day, you get a kind of a reboot of the immune system. There's kind of a stem cell activation of white blood cells that happens in that early stage. The body will rebalance and reset the microbiome, the microbiota, the gut flora. There'll be a remarkable drop in inflammation in the body. So people that have, joint pain and inflammatory changes remarkably in even that 4 to 7 day period. It's remarkable. If you're really dealing with some form of like an early form of cancer or something in that regard, you're really looking at doing more of like a 2 or 3 week fast for that
Okay.
purpose. So they're longer. And when that's longer, I always recommend people to go to True North because they're the people that are doing the best long-term fasting. They have the best monitoring and all of that. So absolutely.
Oh, perfect. So I have two questions from my clients actually that are on the topic of fasting because I want to talk
Yes.
about your book Weightless, but we'll just cover the fasting questions now. So from
Yeah,
Celine here,
absolutely. Let's do that. Yeah, let's do that.
Celine asked, I would like to know his thoughts on fasting practices if you're someone with thyroid issue. Is it beneficial? Only certain hours? And yeah,
No,
those are the
fasting
first question.
actually fasting has a real benefit on the endocrine hormonal system. It tends to reset it. Here's the thing though, when we fast people, we don't fast them on medication. They can't be on any medication except for hormone replacement. So if
Okay.
someone's taking an estrogen or a testosterone or a thyroid hormone, we let them fast with that while they're taking that. So we don't just abruptly change that or recommend that they stop that. But it can actually revamp the thyroid situation. But the follow up is the most important part. And you've got to get into this eating plan that we're talking about, this SOS free, high whole food, plant exclusive diet. And that coupled with a little bit of fast and the lifestyle will help the thyroid significantly. A lot of times early on, thyroid problems are nothing more than iodine deficiency. It's very common. And what happens is people never really check that. So they go to the doc. The doc says you got a low thyroid, TSH levels high. And the first thing they do is they put them on thyroid hormones. But you've got to always remember that whenever you treat the body with a hormone from the outside, the body begins to believe that you're making enough of it and it stops your own natural production. So the bottom line is if you keep taking thyroid hormones, your thyroid will never function again. And that's
Yeah.
why when you ask the doc, how long will I be on this hormone replacement? What's the answer? For life. Because
Yeah.
he knows that by taking it, it's not going to work. So early on, that's where doing the diet, fasting, all of that before you start any of that could have value. Or if you've been taking it and it's not that long, sometimes fasting and lifestyle and nutritional changes can actually reverse it. But if you've been taking it a long time, it's hard to change it because the
Yeah.
thyroid's been shut down for so many years. It's hard for it to come back.
Okay. Well, she definitely eats whole food, plant-based, and she exercises because she's in the
Well,
program,
that's
and she's
all
got
good.
some.
So trying a period of fasting, under good resting conditions may have value to see if there's a way to give that a reboot. But there's no
Yeah.
guarantee. And the bottom line is if she has to take thyroid hormone replacement while she's living her full functional life, God bless. No, don't lose your mind. Don't go
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. And I was gonna give her a little compliment. She has some pretty badass biceps. She has some big biceps for Clyde. So another question she asked: any best practices that you would recommend for those of us lucky enough to be in perimenopause for fasting?
Wow, that's a great question. Perimenopause is kind of a tricky place because it centers around the time when hormones are in the process of change. And what we know is that there are some cultures that don't experience any discomfort at all. And then other cultures, like our own, where there can be really horrendous kinds of changes for people, where they're getting such flashes and mood swings and difficulty sleeping and sweats and all of it. Generally speaking, the perimenopausal time is dependent on what happens before that time. So, for example, in a lot of Eastern cultures, Chinese, Japanese, Asian cultures, they maintain a very low level of estrogen throughout their lifespan. When they get into perimenopause and it starts to drop, the drop is a very small drop. So
Yeah.
they don't really experience symptomatology that much. In the West, we maintain such high levels of these from animal products, from a lot of things that we do. So when it drops, it could be a precipitous drop. And it's the extent of the drop in many ways that creates the devastation of the symptoms. So when it's happening again, just getting on track with this whole food way of eating, actually getting some plant estrogens from soy actually has value.
Yeah.
Getting that more into the diet can actually have value. It's working on the beta receptor, not the alpha receptor, so it doesn't trigger tumor growth, but it can provide plant-based estrogens that can take a little edge off. Physical exercise is key. Trying to work and getting stress levels lower are key. People have used supplements like black cohosh and things of this nature, but the bottom line is um, there are the lifestyle factors go a long way. My partner, Janie Goddard, who runs one of the largest complementary medical associations in the world, has a blog on this menopausal question. And I recommend that you go to it. And you just go to janiegoddard.com or you go on what's called the CMA website, Complementary Medical Association in the UK. But there's a lot of people that have written about it. But I will tell you that by getting the diet really clean, getting rid of the refined foods, the processed foods, getting physical activity up, getting stress management under control can take a lot off in the perimenopausal time.
Beautiful. So I got one more question from Alexandra Paul. You know what Alexandra Paul is from the original Baywatch
No, that
movie?
name sounds familiar. Where would I know him from?
Well, it would be from a Switch for Good podcast. She was in the original Baywatch movie with David Hasselhoff.
Oh, because I know her name. That name is very familiar to me. Okay,
Yeah,
so
so we're
what's
coaching
her
her.
question?
Yeah, so we're coaching her. So she basically mentioned like you kind of answered this, but we have like a more concise answer for her. Will water only fasting cause more lean muscle mass loss than fat loss? Does the metabolism slow down because
No,
it
here's
thinks it's in
here's what no
starvation mode?
here's the big key to fasting, and this is very true generally with metabolism. And I know you understand this, and your viewers will understand this. The body is always looking at, in a way, it's creating an algorithm for itself as to how we're using calories and how we're taking calories in. So, for example, if I decide to really restrict calories, but I decide to push heavy, heavy movement, in a way, I slow down my basal metabolic rate because now the
Yeah.
body's saying, I can't trust you. You're going to use calories that I don't have. So I'm going to just slow you down in the resting state. So
Yeah.
BMR really starts to drop. So what happens in fasting is if you try to do a lot of physical activity when you're fasting, you'll create the same problem. There'll be reactive weight gain after the fast. Metabolism will be really damaged. That's why we recommend absolute bed rest with water only fasting. And when you do, you tend to burn fat more preferentially than muscle. The amount of lean muscle mass, as I mentioned, in an entire 30 days of fasting is only about a pound of lean muscle mass, which is not a lot. And so the bottom line is if you're really resting and you're doing water fasting, you're going to have more of the fat breaking down. In fact, you'll look more cut and more lean because of that. And then when you start eating again, we slowly come back with high quality nutrition. There'll be a certain amount of weight gain that'll come back, but we protect the body wants to protect the lean mass at the expense of fat during a fast. And it will only do that if we rest. If we try to move, it won't do it as much.
Yeah, it makes sense. And honestly, when I was hearing you guys talk about it at NHA, I was like, just sounds like a beautiful vacation. Like all you do is read and lay down and rest and sleep.
It's cool, but what happens, you got to understand something. The body has packed in the abuses of our lives into the layers of the body. And when you start fasting, you start peeling those layers away, and you can have things coming to the surface in terms of detoxification and healing, and it can get rather uncomfortable for people. So
Yeah.
sometimes there can be pain, headache, discharge, things that they didn't have when they came in. Their first response is, "Oh my God, what's happening to me? Something's
Yeah, I'm
wrong."
getting
There's
worse.
nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong. It's just the body unraveling because you've asked the body to do the work of healing and repair. So now when
Yeah.
it starts happening, you've got to get right with it. And it's hard for us because all of us, if you think about it, we've been brought up to see those actions as things that we need to medicate out of existence.
Yeah.
If you have a fever, there's a reason for a fever. It's not to suppress the fever. The fever's there to deal with a bacterial or viral infection or some injury or trauma to the body. If you just automatically say, I'm going to suppress the fever with an aspirin or whatever, that's not helping anything because the body is trying to heal you. So getting that mindset into our lives is not easy when we've all been brought up to fear our own vitality. And I
Yeah.
teach people that all the time.
People want to be comfortable all the time too. That's the other part. Though don't
And we
medicate. They're
want,
like, yeah.
yeah, they're saying, look, I want to heal, I want to recover, I want to improve the quality of my life. But you know what? Make sure it's pretty comfortable when I do that. The bottom line, it's not always comfortable when you do that. Because if you think about it, fat is not only a source of energy, most of the toxins in the body are fat soluble. So the fat
Yeah.
tissue is a garbage dump too. So when I start breaking down fat cells for energy, I'm throwing all of that stuff back in the bloodstream that now has to get out of the body. And it comes out through the skin, the mouth, the eyes, the nose, the vagina in women. The body will find any avenue it can to get rid of that stuff.
Yeah. I think that's one part people don't understand when it comes to fat loss is like the amount of toxicity that is the toxins that are stored inside the fat.
When people decide they want to come and fast, we instruct them about all of those things. In fact,
Yeah.
I have to do a basic blood test to look at kidney function, blood studies, all of that before I even tell somebody that they're a candidate for fasting. And then we tell them what to try to avoid for a few days before they come, so it's a little bit easier. You don't want to
Yeah.
come into a fast drinking 10 cups of coffee. And now you come into the fast and I take it away because you're going to be a lunatic in 1 or 2
Yeah.
days. You're going to have a headache. It feels like your head's blowing off your shoulders. So, so we let people know, look, if you're going to come in fast, we want to work with this a little bit. So you're going to cut down on these things. So it'll be a little bit of an easier transition.
Yeah, because I can't even imagine not saying these things and just getting all
Oh
those
no, no, we got
reactions.
no, we got to tell people, we got to tell people all that. Yeah, all the time. So.
Yeah, awesome. Perfect. So I'd love to talk about your new book, Weightless. It
Oh,
it came out
there
like
it is.
less than
That's
like
what it
30
looks
days
like.
ago.
That beautiful heart with all the veggies on it. Yes.
Yeah, so it's called Weightless Compassionate Weight Loss for Life, and you wrote it with Dr. T. Colin Campbell.
No, I wrote it by myself. He just wrote the
Oh,
forward.
the
I
forward.
I don't write with anybody because nobody wants to write with me. I'm a maniac. So the
I'm the
bottom line
same.
is I had a good editor, and Colin was lovely to write just a beautiful forward. He was so enthused with this book that he was so happy to endorse it, and I was happy that he was happy. So, look, I wrote this book for a very basic reason, because when we look at the biggest pandemic that's affecting the world today, it is excessive weight and body fat. There is no question about it. Right
Yeah.
now, 40% of the world is overweight, and in the next 10 years, 50% is going to be overweight and overfat. And the industry, the dieting industry in countries like ours, is between a 50 and $100 billion industry with a 95 to 98% failure rate.
Yeah.
So it creates such hopelessness in people. And then they try to sell them that the idea that to achieve your health and weight loss goals, you've got to eat animal products and some form of processed food. So a high paleo, high keto, this diet, carnivore diet. The idea is that there's no way you can achieve your health and weight loss goals without devastating, killing animals and harming the environment. I just got tired of that message. So this
Yeah.
particular book covers not only the food, it covers the full constellation of lifestyle factors, including sleep and stress and physical activity and food, and psycho-emotional factors involved in this story, while also advocating and supporting the lives and rights of animals and the protection of the environment. It has never been done in a weight loss or weight book before. It's the first
Yeah.
time it's ever been done. And so I wanted to really make that impact on the idea that this is, when we eat food, when you make food choices, even for weight loss or fitness, you've got to understand that these choices have consequences far beyond the borders of your own plate. They're affecting industries and animals and the environment around us. We need to have that consciousness when we make these choices. And as it turns out, when you choose the plant exclusive approach and this lifestyle, you have the most sustainable long term results too, while helping everything around you. What a mystery, what magic. And so that's what I wanted to do. I just needed to free people from this idea that they need risky fad diets and now, of course, drugs like Ozempic and all of these other drugs to
Yeah.
lose weight. It's just an absurd notion that when you're embracing the low calorie dense, high fiber plant foods and you're moving more and you're understanding the impact of sleep and stress and the impact on the environment, you're taking such a beautiful connection to what you really need to do. So for me, it's a manual of hope because and love, because no matter how many times somebody may have failed to take weight off, or no matter how many times you've taken weight off and you put it back on, you need to know that it's still hope out there by embracing a more concerted lifestyle approach that covers the constellation of factors that you need to look at. And that's what this book is about.
What would be a tidbit that you wrote in the book that you were very excited to share with people, that you love for people to kind of, get ahead, so that, to get them to read the book?
Well, see, the nice thing about the book too is the book has a number of strategies and jumpstart and recipes and whole tools for eating out in the real world. So it covers a lot of very practical things and emphasizing the fact that we're herbivore, frugivore animals, not carnivores. But for me, the whole issue of dealing with the stuff we alluded to a little earlier, the impact of food addiction and addiction, how we
Yeah.
program pleasure in our choices, and how we are so lost in the ways that we look at body image and the fact that the psychological damage that's associated with that. So for me, the addiction and psycho-emotional parts of the book, which is the whole last section of the book. The last section was one of my favorite things to write because it covers all of the psychological and emotional components of this story, including the whole process of addiction and
Yeah.
why that becomes generated and what we can do with simple tools and skills to really adjust that we need. And too often that's overlooked. And it talks about how to make small changes and the importance of commitment to yourself and self-esteem and forgiveness and self-love. All of those pieces are so important and so powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. So where can people find more about the book, and where can people get the book?
The book's just on Amazon.com. Just go to Weightless, Dr. Frank Sabatino, and now it's an ebook version too. So if you want a digital version, you can get the digital version too.
What is a project that you're currently working on that you're
Okay.
excited about, that you would like to share with the audience besides the book?
Oh, what I'm excited about is I'm excited about doing our retreats because I get a chance to work hands-on. I do so many things online, Zoom and interviews and things like this. To be able to work with people one-on-one at our retreats is really a treat for me because that's where I'm really the strongest. because I have the greatest impact by, like you do, you're training people, that they're with me. We're connecting. I like people on. So that's passion for me.
For everyone listening, I will put the link down below so you guys can look into the retreats. You can get a copy of the book. Frank, I want to say a massive thank you for taking over 90 minutes of your busy schedule to record with me. I really appreciate it. And for everyone listening, if you enjoyed the episode, be sure to share it with someone that would benefit from it. Go support Dr. Sabatino's work. Again, check out the book, check out the retreat, and we will see everyone in the next episode.